Tonight on SUTV World News, Prince Philip is out of the hospital and the war in Syria reaches a grim milestone. That and more on our coverage begins right now on SUTV World News. Good evening and welcome to SUTV World News. I'm Adam Beam. Britain's Prince Philip is back at Windsor Castle after being in the hospital for a month. The 99-year-old has been recovering after undergoing heart surgery, and a royal source says he's in, quote, good spirits. CNN's Max Foster has more from Windsor.
This is the longest stay Prince Philip has had in hospital, as far as we're aware, at least. He was in hospital in London for a month, now safely back in his bubble here at Windsor Castle with the Queen and key household staff. We know that he was treated for an infection at hospital in London, also went through a procedure for an existing heart condition. Beyond that, he's only said he wishes to thank all the medical staff who looked after him at both King Edward VII's Hospital and St Bartholomew's Hospital, and everyone who sent in their good wishes as well. We saw him leaving hospital in a car. He was sitting upright, he looked well, and indeed a royal source says the Duke is in good spirits, so some good news there. Max Foster, CNN, Windsor, England.
Russia is denying it interfered in the 2020 election, despite a U.S. intelligence report concluding it did. The Kremlin says it had nothing to do with any misinformation campaigns against any candidate. The U.S. intelligence report released Tuesday found foreign adversaries, including Russia, attempted to undermine public confidence in the election process. The Kremlin called those claims, quote, baseless, unsubstantiated, and incorrect, end quote. The Biden administration is considering further sanctions against Russia, China, and Iran because of the alleged election interference. Russia says it's considering retaliatory measures. Hong Kong has announced plans to open more vaccination centers and make immunizations available for more people as the government tries to fend off a fifth wave of COVID-19. Will Ripley reports from Hong Kong.
As Hong Kong fights to fend off a possible fifth wave of COVID-19, nowhere is immune. This weekend, hundreds of healthcare workers and police sealed off several upscale neighborhoods, ordering thousands to line up for testing and lock down to wait for results.
It was a little overwhelming. We didn't know what to expect. Suddenly the building was taped up and there were a lot of cops, and there was a medical crew that walked in hazmat suits, so it was all very sudden.
Hong Kong began ambush-style lockdowns in late January, targeting clusters in densely populated lower-income areas. These are the first to hit the high-rent districts, full of expats, foreign residents finding themselves on the front line of Hong Kong's latest outbreak.
Granted that we've had COVID for about a year and suddenly this comes up, we were a bit surprised,
Yeah.
But I guess these measures need to be taken to avoid a next wave outbreak.
The hundreds of people who live in these buildings and others in the area won't be allowed to leave until all of this testing is complete. They have to stay in their homes. Health authorities say this latest super spreader event started here at this popular fitness center, raising questions about safety just weeks after Hong Kong allowed gyms to reopen.
More than 100 cases are linked to this single gym. The cluster has closed schools, offices, and forced hundreds into government quarantine centers, locked down for 14 days, including single mom Jen Berman.
And the most stressful thing is just the uncertainty, and it was the not knowing. It's getting that phone call. My main concern was my son. It was really just not knowing if he was going to have to quarantine with me, what the results were going to be, because if I turned out to be positive, it means that my son would have to quarantine and go through this process too. And obviously as a mom, it's your worst nightmare for them to have to go through something like this.
Children may have a harder time coping with quarantine, mental health experts say.
And young children in particular really thrive on safety, security, and consistency. And so when their whole world is kind of turned upside down, that can be really disruptive. And as I mentioned, it can be quite traumatic.
Hong Kong has one of the world's harshest quarantine policies, up to 3 weeks for incoming travelers, 2 weeks for anyone in close contact with the infected. The city is just beginning COVID-19 vaccinations. Most may have to wait months before they can get a shot, potentially meaning more outbreaks, more lockdowns, more damage to the already devastated local economy. Just as many hoped, Life was finally getting back to normal. Will Ripley, CNN, Hong Kong.
As coronavirus cases surge across Europe, at least 16 countries are now temporarily suspending injections of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, while experts investigate reports of blood clots. And the pause is sparking grave concern amongst health experts and officials around the world. John Lornick has the latest.
We mustn't actually take rapid action that may damage the vaccine rollout, which is so dangerous.
As Italy enters a new partial lockdown, registering its highest daily death increase since late January, France faces a third wave in the pandemic, and Poland's third wave accelerates, with cases up 44% from just last week. Health officials are concerned about a growing number of countries pausing injections of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine amid reports of blood clots.
I don't think that they're making the right decision, and I hope that they will reverse the decision.
These are very rare thrombo events or blood clots. We need to evaluate these very, very carefully.
There is no known link between the vaccine and these events, and AstraZeneca says there's no evidence of increased risk of blood clots. The company says fewer than 40 clot events have been reported out of more than 17 million people who received a shot in the EU and UK.
It's important that people who suspect that they have a side effect after vaccination report this to the National Medicines Regulator or to a healthcare professional who can help them to do so.
Now, the European Medicines Agency worries this may affect people wanting to get vaccinated.
We are worried that that there may be an effect on the trust of the vaccines.
I'm John Lawrence reporting.
The Vatican is reiterating its stance on blessing same-sex relationships. In a statement Monday, the church says homosexual unions do not have its blessings, saying, quote, "It is not licit to impart a blessing on relationships or partnerships, even stable, that involves sexual activity outside of marriage, as is the case of the unions between persons of the same sex," end quote. The statement was approved by Pope Francis. The Vatican says gays and lesbians can receive blessings if they live according to the church's teachings. The church released the statement in response to questions from pastors and the faithful. It started 10 years ago this week with peaceful pro-democracy protests in Dara. A decade on, we mark the depressing reality that is Syria in 2021. The country and its people brutally torn apart, the battles between regional and global state actors settling bloody scores through support for groups on the ground, breeding terror that has spread around the world. Ben Weidman has covered Syria since long before the civil war there. He shows us how a peaceful uprising descended into a multinational bloodbath.
Al-Assad or we burn the country, regime loyalists like to chant. And over the last 10 years, as Syria has plummeted deeper into the abyss, the country has burned, and President Bashar al-Assad has clung to power. An uprising that started peacefully has left as many as 500,000 dead by some estimates. The United Nations gave up counting 5 years ago. More than half the population has been driven from their homes or has fled the country. Unwilling to concede that his dynastic regime and decades of oppression were to blame, Assad called it a foreign conspiracy. And indeed, the uprising has become a multinational bloodbath. The U.S. and its Gulf allies initially provided the divided opposition with just enough money and weapons to keep fighting, but never enough to win. And the failure of that opposition opened the door to ISIS and its brutal brand of madness, which brought American and European boots to Syrian soil. Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah came to Assad's aid, followed by the full might of Russia. Turkey also joined the fray, along with Israel. Syria today is a kaleidoscope of conflicts, pitting superpowers, regional powers, local powers against one another, now in a stalemate. quagmire where it has become costly to stay, perhaps even more costly to leave. Dreams of freedom faded long ago. Syrian-American author and journalist Alia Malik witnessed the early years of the conflict.
Order and stability, I think, have emerged as things that are more important to the international community than the messiness of a true sort of open or democratic society. The fear of like ISIS-type Islamist militants is psychologically terrorizes people more than the idea of like a butcher in an Armani suit.
The official Syrian media portrays Assad's survival as a victory that has left him ruling over just part of his devastated country, a traumatized population, and an economy in free fall due to corruption and sanctions. If this is victory, what is defeat? Ben Wiedemann, CNN, Beirut.
And that's it for SUTV World News. I'm Adam Beam. Be sure to follow us on all our social media at SUTV News and check out our website at sutvnews.org. We're back with ship news and more tomorrow, but until then, good night.